When Frederico and the Gravedigger surf the deserts of Micovi looking for leads, blood will soak the sands. Welcome to the serialized audiobook, The Detective, written by Scott Sigler and Matt Wallace, narrated by Scott Sigler. Hello, junkies. So much going on in my writing career right now. Working on so many books, it's nuts. And my upcoming novel, Alien Phalanx, an original novel in the Alien universe due out in 2020, is starting to get some media coverage. After the episode, I will talk about the very interesting social media reaction to this book. Siglerfest 2K19 is coming up. It's October 10th to 12th in Las Vegas. It's cheap to fly. It's cheap to stay. Come have a good time with us. Details are at scottsigler.com/Siglerfest, SIGLERFEST. Meet your fellow junkies. Hang out with me and the Director of Doom. This is our 9th annual Siglerfest, and it's going to be the biggest one yet. Now, let's get on with the exploits of Frederico Esteban Giuseppe Gonzaga in episode number 5 of The Detective. Chapter 13. The Elephant's Graveyard. Someone slapped Fred in the face. "Wake up, kid!" The old-timer's voice, but whispering, not the shrill screech it had been during the sandrail chase. Fred's eyes blinked open. He was upside down, half hanging from seat restraints, half held in place by the hardened crash fiber. The old man was pulling away chunks of the thick fiber, trying to free Fred enough to move. It was dark, too dark to see much of anything. "We're not dead," Fred said. "Can't put that one past you," the old-timer said. "I'll give credit where credit is due, son. You're the best driver I ever saw, but we just got plain lucky." The old man hit the release button on Fred's restraints. Fred dropped in a heap on his head, then awkwardly rolled to his side. He looked up, looked around. The upside-down rail had slammed nose first into some kind of container, punching through the thin metal and crunching to a stop. Fred saw the vehicle's entry hole and, beyond it, Micovi's 3 purple moons. "I can hear them shuckers out there looking for us," the old man said. "Hopefully things just kind of take care of themselves." "And how would that happen?" "This is a dumping ground for illegal weapons. Sometimes things have a tendency to go boom." The digger made a mushroom cloud with his hands, and the sound of a massive explosion with his mouth that ended up sounding more like a raspberry. Fred heard the sound of an engine echoing through the site. Their pursuers were close. He carefully got to his feet, his body throbbing complaint. The container was full of some kind of artillery shells. He had to step carefully to find purchase on the curved surfaces and hoped that these rounds, at least, had been fully diffused. He reached the edge of the hole made by the rail and looked out. Wrecks and husks stretched out at least a kilometer before him, a graveyard of the purest nation's once aggressive ways. Ill-formed roads snaked between the machines of death, some mostly blocked by windswept dunes. So much hardware, and none of it had mattered when the millions of Creterakian soldiers swept across the deserts and plains like a plague of 10-pound locusts, each carrying a deadly entropic rifle. But all of that was long before Fred's time. He felt no loss at the nation's former glory. Behind him, he heard the clang of a foot rolling off a shell. The old man caught up to him, looked out. The lights of their pursuer's sandrail played against the hull of an old shuttle, then the machine turned the corner and came into view. Fred saw the plasma cannon gunner, his pedipalp hands gripping the controls of the powerful weapon. The old-timer elbowed Fred and whispered, "Hey, that's a quith." "Can't put one past you," Fred whispered back. "That's an alien. Aliens aren't allowed on Micovi." "You don't say." "I don't know what you did," the old-timer said, "but you must have pissed off the wrong guy if someone sent a quith here." Fred nodded. He had pissed off the wrong guy. He just didn't know who that guy was. Then, a bony hand wrapped tight around his mouth. He started to react, automatically bringing his elbow up to drive it into the old-timer's throat, but stopped himself a split second before killing the man. "Shh," the old-timer hissed, so quiet it was almost inaudible. Don't move a muscle. Fred's body tensed. He wasn't used to letting anyone touch him, ever, but then he heard it. He heard the flapping and fluttering of wings. Bats. A stream of the horrific little creatures flew across Fred's field of vision, from left to right, heading for the crawler down below. They came so close, he felt the air from their wings. In that moment, Fred felt the instinctive fear he shared with 2 generations of nationalites born since the takeover. When the bats are close, you don't move. You don't give them any reason to think you're a threat. The last one passed by. The old man's hand slid away. Fred looked down, more with his eyes than with his whole head. A flash of amber light. The blast of an entropic rifle sizzling into the purple sand just to the side of the pursuing sandrail. Creterakians didn't always tell you to stay still. Sometimes they led with a warning shot. Anyone in the Purist Nation knew that. The Qwith warrior was not from the Purist Nation. The big warrior pivoted the plasma cannon, turning to face the threat. He didn't even complete the turn before 3 more amber blasts hit him. The first struck his right pedipalp arm, the second his center chest, the third his right leg. The warrior let out the Qwith equivalent of a scream, a barking, grinding sound that Fred would not soon forget. The pedipalp arm dissolved, and a hand fell away to the rail's rear deck, still fizzling and disintegrating as the entropic effect crawled down the forearm. Maybe the reaction would run out of steam before it reached the fingers, or maybe the whole hand would just vanish in a puff of atoms. The shot in the chest, of course, was what killed him. The expanding hole first cut off that scream, then ended his life. His body slumped to the deck, what was left of his chest evaporating away just like the severed hand. The rail shot forward but didn't get far. Fred watched, knowing what was coming. Once the bats started firing, they didn't stop until everyone in front of them was dead. He didn't see the shot that killed the driver, but he heard the scream. Fred and the old-timer sat very, very still. They breathed slowly. They focused on making no noise at all. The echoes of the screams faded, then died away. Fred could hear his own heartbeat and the faint hiss of the desert wind sliding across fine sand. Then, a few minutes later, they heard the flapping of wings fading away into the distance. The old-timer let out a slow hiss of air. He spoke, no longer in a whisper, but not very loud either. I wish I could say I feel bad about those spawns of Satan getting vaped, but I don't. Spawns of Satan? I thought you just said because something is in the scripture doesn't mean it's right. Not all things are right, the old man said. Some are. Or at least in the case of aliens chasing me down and trying to kill me, the scriptures are dead on. Fred nodded. Can't argue with that. So, how far to the graveyard? We're in the graveyard. The one for people, Fred said. The one that you run. Well, if we walk, we might make it before daybreak. I know you're not from here, young gun, but I'll say you don't want to be on foot on the purple sand when the sun comes up. How far of a drive? The old man tilted his head back toward the sandrail embedded in the container wall. I ain't much of a mechanic if that's what you're asking. You don't have to be a mechanic, Fred said. He pointed down to the larger sandrail below. You just have to be good with a mop and a bucket. The old man stared down, then nodded. Yep, I guess if we wait an hour, the bats be truly gone. They won't come back if no one fires off that plasma cannon. I'll do my best not to pull the trigger. The old-timer sighed. Well, this is going to be messy, but then again, cleaning up dead bodies is what I do for a living. Let's get it done. And while we're at it, do watch your step. I'm pretty sure the shells we're standing on are alive. Chapter 14. Stacks, Skulls, and Stones. Aside from the general stickiness and bits of flesh they hadn't cleaned up, the borrowed sandrail was quite a nice machine. Fred enjoyed the ride. He just tried not to think too much about why the seat was a little damp. He wished he could sell it. The thing was brand new and would fetch a great price, but to show up anywhere civilized with this thing was the same as saying, I killed the original owners. Fortunately, if there was any civilization around, it was out of range of sight. The sun was just coming up over the purple sand as Fred and the old-timer reached the graveyard. I hope this was worth it, Fred said. I know those warriors would have put a hurting on us, but a lot of people want to hurt me. I get by just fine avoiding them as opposed to seeing sentients die. I can give you what you need, the digger assured him. Don't worry about that. See that big rock over there? The one on top of that high dune? Pull up to the right of that, but go slow, and don't drive past the rock. Fred did as he was told. Like the sand, most rocks in this area were purple. This one was lined with crystals of quartz that reflected the morning sun. The sandrail slowed to a stop, kicking up a few whirling dervishes of purple dust. Fred killed the engine and waited for the desert wind to take the dust away. A valley stretched in every direction below them. Fred saw dark cracks in the soil, huge black veins everywhere he looked. Once, centuries or even eons ago, this might have been a lake, or even an ocean. Now it was equal parts super cemetery and human landfill. Welcome to Micovi's second biggest industry, son, the digger said. This is Grim Tyrant Valley. The graves numbered in the tens of thousands. Most were cheap wooden crosses slapped together with nails and glue. Those were broken up here and there by modest headstones, small crescents of hand-carved rock made by the families of the deceased. Fred estimated they were outnumbered by the discount crosses 20-1. As many graves as might have been dug and marked down there, however, they were nothing compared to the number of bodies that were piled stories high at regular intervals across the valley. Fred couldn't smell them. Dampening filters erected on tall poles surrounded the perimeter of the valley, but he could see the deep levels of decomposition in most of them, as if they'd been lying there for a year or more. Then he spotted the piles. There were nothing but broken skeletons. He didn't have to say anything. The old man could read it plainly on his face. Budget cuts, the digger explained. About a decade ago, I had a staff of 23. Now I got a staff of 5. The backlist of bodies is a mile long. We get to them as we're able. But I promise you, whatever state they're in, every single departed soul you see down there will get their day. I'll put them all on the ground eventually. At the far end of the valley, Fred saw a hover barge approaching. Rusted and well used, it was the kind of vehicle that hauled all sorts of things. On it, he saw 2 logos, the twin green crescents of Ringgold Incorporated and a symbol that had been universally known across human space since even before the days of spaceflight, the biohazard symbol. The barge closed in on the sprawling graveyard. Down on a concrete slab strewn with curls of purple sand, a man waved 2 handheld orange cones at the barge. The battered machine closed in and stopped above the slab. The man ran out of the way, then the barge's bottom doors opened. Bodies spilled out. Fred guessed there were 30, maybe 40, all landing in a pile of lifeless humanity. He felt numb. Mine workers? He asked, as if that mattered. Probably 80%, the digger confirmed. Maybe more. Fred was ghost pale and his voice came out in a rasp. He gestured to the whole valley, to the sprawl of crosses and monuments, to the piles of skeletons and rotted bodies, to the freshly dropped miners. How in the hell could you possibly find anyone in all of that? It's my life's work, boy, the old-timer said. Now, you wanted this. Shall we get on with it or what? Fred realized the old man was right. This was his choice, and what could be the last piece of the puzzle might be down there somewhere. Which way? He asked the old-timer. The man pointed out a path that led down the valley to the operation below. Fred put the rail in drive, and they started down. Chapter 15. Family. Federico understood the concept of death. He understood it far more than most. He had killed. He had watched friends die in battle, seen sentients executed for no reason at all. Much of his life, in fact, had revolved around death, dealing with it or dealing it out. Now, however, he understood he'd been dealing with a lowercase d death. In Grim Tyrant Valley, he saw what capital D death was all about. Fred and the Gravedigger had spent hours walking through dirt paths that wound through the stacks and piles of corpses that made up Grim Tyrant Valley. All of Micovi's dead wound up here. So many, in all stages of decomposition, and, worst of all, the smell. The Gravedigger gave Fred a soiled cloth to hold over his nose and mouth. The smell didn't seem to bother the old-timer at all. Fred felt choked by it, and not just his lungs. His entire body and brain felt oppressed by this place, as if the death was constantly closing in around him, threatening to crush him, make him part of the landscape. The whole place was a giant, blaring message that death is coming for you, and there is nothing you can do about it. Fred might have been overwhelmed by it, but the calm of the Gravedigger kept him tethered. He focused on the old man, who might have been strolling through a garden in which he took great pride. Still, the number of plots and people was staggering. Fred couldn't imagine ever finding a single one in this place. After 15 minutes of walking, the stacks of unprocessed bodies gave way to an endless vista of cheap gravestones. Not granite, oh no, these were made from Micovi's version of limestone. If you were poor, they wouldn't even waste good rock on you. Fred tried to estimate the number of graves, but gave up almost immediately. They were uncountable. The old man didn't seem fazed by the vista of death, however. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. More than that, as they walked past each grave, whether they were marked with an epitaph or not, the digger recited names, droning them like the refrain of some dour church song. Horace and Malachi, Harel Barbara, Migliorelli Paul, Urich Philip. How do you do that? Fred asked after the first 20 or 30 names. The old man seemed annoyed by the interruption. I told you, this here's my life's work. Not just seeing them put by, but seeing that at least one body remembers who they was. How much farther? You worry too much about distance, boy. Look around. We all end up in the same place. Fred assumed the old man was using Grim Tyrant Valley as a metaphor because no way Fred would ever wind up here. His mortal remains forever on Micovi? He'd rather wind up as Sklorno poop. The Gravedigger went on reciting names. Fred's count reached deeply into the hundreds as the day wore on. They had to walk for hours to find it. Fred lost all sense of direction, and he had to trust that the old man would be able to get them back to the sandrail. Finally, the old man stopped in front of a grave. He pointed to the headstone, which was just beginning to show the rounding effects of weathering. There she is, he said. Constance Carbonaro. Fred's stomach hurt from the constant intake of the stench. Limestone. Not even the granite that he'd spent weeks chipping at while posing as a mine worker. In large lettering, the name Constance Carbonaro was pounded into the stone across the top. Below that was another inscription. It read, Beloved Mother and Wife of Killian. That's her, Fred said. The old man looked triumphant. Told you. Killian, the husband. Is there one for him in this place? The digger shook his head. He ain't buried. Less'n he's still on the pile, he ain't here. Sometimes they turn to bone before we can properly get to 'em. Then if they don't have an identity, it's hard to figure out who they were. Fred grimaced beneath the handcloth. Based on that, he made the odds 50-50 on whether or not Quentin's father was in Grim Tyrant Valley. Fred looked around again, taking in the sprawling expanse of headstones. Has anyone else been looking through here lately? You mean like those insect-looking fellers tried to blow us up recently? Yeah, exactly like that. Haven't heard nothing. Fred nodded. He was quiet for a long time, considering, weighing, judging. Finally, he said, If she didn't have a marked grave, would you still remember where she is? The digger tapped a withered fingertip against the deep, wrinkled lines of his temple. I never forgot what I put in the ground. Good. I need you to trust me on something. What's that? Without answering, Fred raised his booted foot and smashed it into the marker. It fell back, already broken in two. Fred stomped both of the pieces, hitting it again and again until the letters were shattered, and even then, he used his heel to ground anything that resembled the letter into reddish powder. The old gravedigger said nothing. Neither did his eyes seem to judge Fred's actions. The headstones weren't the gravedigger's business. His business was remembrance. Still, it was a crappy thing to do. But, Fred decided, if Quentin wanted to return for his mother or mark her grave, he could. The old man would know where to find her. Right now, it was more important to Fred to keep any and all intel he could out of the enemy's hands, whomever that enemy was. He had gathered enough information that it was time to communicate with his employer. It was time to report to Quentin. But with Greedock the Splithead's goons always watching the Kraken's QB, it wasn't as easy as making the 5-day trip from Micovi to Ionath and having lunch. Well, sometimes it was that easy, but the odds were that the quiff he dealt with in the old shipyard had worked for Greedock. Best to be cautious, get Quentin off Ionath altogether, and also probably best not to contact the kid directly. To make that happen, Fred had to call in a favor from one Rachel Gesford, Commissioner of Dinolition. Chapter 16. Carnie. Fred had scheduled transport to Wilson 6. Dinolition was a crude thing, more barbarism than sport, but a certain type of person loved it. Dinolition was growing in popularity. Soon it might spread galaxy-wide, but for now there were few places to see it. One of those was the desolate area of Wilson 6 known as the Wastes. Dinolition was popular enough that people traveled there regularly to see the genetically engineered monsters duke it out. Fred raised no suspicion when he booked travel to Wilson 6 under yet another assumed name. But before he departed Micovi, he had to see if Carnie had found anything. And if that meant another round of food at Mr. Sam's, well, that was yet another expensable meal. Hopefully, Quentin wouldn't mind if Fred was a big tipper. Sunset came and went. A good 2 hours after darkness fell, Fred sat at a table at Mr. Sam's, a half-eaten slab of ribs in front of him. After a while, nothing but bones remained, and still no sign of Carnie. Mr. Sam sat behind his counter, watching Fred eat. It should have felt uncomfortable, but Mr. Sam watched people eat the way a master painter watched people admire his work. Fred was ready to give up and head for the shuttleport when the door swung wide open, and Carnie came rushing in like a man late for an important date. He spotted Fred, and relief seemed to wash over him. He headed for the table. "What'll you take, son?" Mr. Sam asked automatically from behind the counter. Carnie was stopped dead by the question. Then he looked on the verge of panic. I don't have any money." Fred came to his rescue. "Get him some brisket, will you, Mr. Sam?" The kindly proprietor nodded his bulbous chin. "Coming right up." Carnie slipped into a chair across from Fred, smiling. "I don't need to eat." "It's the least I can do. Looks like you've been running around some." Fred let the kid get some food and drink in before he pressed Carnie about what, if any, information he'd been able to gather. "I asked around," Carnie said around a mouthful of brisket. "The women at the replenishing stations loved to talk, but it seemed like none of them had anything to say about the girl. I spent all day asking around. I was ready to give it up. I wasn't even going to come here. Then I got lucky. I found an old friend of hers from when they were kids." Fred's synapses began to fire a little faster upon hearing that. His instinct was to dig into Carnie and squeeze every relevant fact out of him, but he stayed silent and let the kid finish on his own. "The woman's name is Amanda," Carnie said. "Amanda Sparrow. She's around the age you said. Anyway, Amanda said Janine, ran away years ago." "Ran away where?" "She said Janine talked about stowing away and making it to Quith space. Said that was the last time anyone saw her." Fred frowned. That wasn't a lead. It was a fairy tale. Janine could be anywhere. Anything might have happened to her in the intervening years. "Thanks for trying, Carnie. Can't win them all, I guess." "You don't understand," Carnie said. "She made it out. She left Purist Nation space. She got all the way to the Quith homeworld. She's probably still there now. How could you possibly know that? Carnie reached inside his shirt, being very careful, as if he were concealing something alive in there. What he removed, however, was a plain-looking piece of folded paper. Amanda got a letter from her. Fred found he couldn't even process that. Not an electronic message, something that traveled at the speed of light, but a physical piece of paper. Moved, presumably, from Quith space to the outskirts of the Purist Nation. It wasn't possible. How could she have sent a letter here? Carnie took another bite of brisket. He talked with his mouth full, and Fred didn't care. You know how it is. Aliens aren't supposed to set foot on Purist Nation soil and all that, but that doesn't mean most of the black market goods around the colony don't come from their ships. There's a lot of folks who'll pay to get word to the people they had to leave behind. Carnie handed over the aged piece of paper. Amanda didn't want to give it up at first, he said. I had to trade her all the store tokens I had on me. Plus, I got to go on a date with one of her sisters. Any other time, Fred might have laughed at that last bit, but right then his focus was like a laser pointed at that letter. He unfolded it. The handwriting was young and feminine. He flashed on that right away. Turning it over carefully in his hands, he noted the wear seemed natural and authentic. There was no last name, but it was signed Janine. He read it. Janine spoke of bribing a freighter captain to smuggle her off Micovi into Red Storm City in the Jupiter Net Colony. She didn't specify what she'd bribed him with or how. Fred didn't want to know that detail, and he was sure Quentin wouldn't either. Janine went on to write about finding a job as a waitress in a nightclub called Halftimers in Red Storm City's manufacturing district. And she spoke of a brother, one who'd been executed for stealing food. She wrote that she still thought about him at night. It was enough. More than enough, in fact. Carnie, this is... Fred found he genuinely didn't have the words. Except for two. Thank you. No problem, man. I'm happy I could deliver. Fred took out a handful of credits. Let me pay you for your time and trouble. I don't want that, Carnie said immediately. Fred placed the credits on the table in front of him. Take them, he insisted. You earned it. Carnie didn't protest further. You sure you gotta go? You could crash at my place tonight. Fred was already tucking the letter away and gathering his gear. It's still not the right time, Carn. Carnie nodded. I figured you'd say that. You've been a big help, Fred said, and he meant it. I won't forget that. Or you. On the transport to Wilson 6, Fred read and reread that letter at least a dozen times. There was nothing concrete about this lead, but it seemed so convincing. Should he tell Quentin about it? No, not yet. It would be enough of a shock when Quentin heard about his mother. Fred didn't need to compound the situation with news of an unknown sister that might, or might not, still be alive. Once Fred finished on Wilson 6, he would track the letter back to its source. For now, though, he would only report the things that he knew to be true. That was episode number 5 of The Detective. Fred has a clue. He has a lead. And in the next episode, Fred will have a run-in with one Quentin Barnes. Episode 6 of The Detective ties that book in with The Starter, which is book 2 of the Galactic Football League series. So come on back for it. You will not be disappointed. So, my novel, Alien Phalanx. The reactions for it online are interesting. Obviously, there's a bunch of people who've never read my work who are poo-pooing several aspects of the idea. A bunch of people also saying it sounds really cool. But let me read you the synopsis, and you can judge for yourself. Edagina was an isolated world of medieval castles, varied cultures, and conquests, vibrant until the demons rose and spread relentless destruction. Swarms of lethal creatures with black husks, murderous claws, barbed tails, and dreaded tooth tongues raged through the lowlands, killing 90% of the planet's population. Terrified survivors fled to hidden mountain keeps where they eke out a meager existence. When a trio of young warriors discovers a new weapon, they see a chance to end this curse. To save humanity, the trio must fight their way to the tunnels of Black Smoke Mountain, the lair of the mythical demon Mother. That's the synopsis for the book. I think it sounds pretty cool. It's a medieval story, but there's already people butthurt online that it's about knights because, the only medieval culture in the history of the world was Western European knights, right? Forget feudal Japan and Asia, forget Africa. It's all about knights. And you can just see these people sitting there going, actually, bro, knights wouldn't stand a chance against xenomorphs. Actually, that's in some of the comments on the YouTube pieces that have been filed out there. And no, knights would not. Good thing there aren't any knights in this story. My favorite part of this so far, and keep in mind, a lot of the reaction is very positive, but the negative reaction catches one's attention. But I love how the experts of aliens and medieval culture both are bitching, who are bitching about this, don't realize that knights didn't really use the phalanx formation. And the name of the book is Alien Phalanx. Well, Alien Phalanx is due out in 2020. I hope you grab a copy. And if you do, I hope you dig it. That is it for this week. We will be back next week with episode number 6 of The Detective. And until then, we will talk to you all real soon. You have been listening to The Detective, a Galactic Football League novella. The Detective is also available as an ebook and as a full-length audiobook. If you want the whole story with no waiting, visit scottsigler.com/The Detective for links to Amazon, Audible, and more. Follow Scott on Instagram and Twitter, where he is at Scott Sigler, one word, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Scott Sigler. The Detective audiobook was directed by A.B. Kovacs and engineered by Steve Rickyberg. Copyright 2019, Empty Set Entertainment, all rights reserved. Theme music is from the band Amps and Volts.